The ballroom air tasted like judgment, an expensive perfume, a suffocating mix that instantly tightened my chest. As a trauma nurse, I handle code blues with steady hands, but this social pit, it terrified me. Then I saw her, Elise, my ex, cutting through the crowd with that familiar, predatory smile that promised humiliation. Panic bypassed my logic entirely. I reached blindly for the only safe thing in the room, Remy's arm. Before I could stop myself, the lie spilled out, loud and desperate. "She's not just my friend," I announced to the approaching threat. "She's my fiancée." Remy didn't pull away. For 10 years, she has been the chaotic, brilliant color to my structured, grayscale life. The artist covering our floor in canvas while I memorized anatomy charts. We were opposites who grounded each other, building a private world of silence and proximity that survived graduation and every failed relationship I'd ever had. It worked because there was always a boundary, a thin, invisible line we respected. We touched, yes, hugs after long shifts, a head on a shoulder during movies, but it was always careful, platonic, safe. Tonight was supposed to be just another favor. Another moment of her holding me up when my knees threatened to buckle. I remember arriving earlier, the humidity clinging to my dress, my stomach rolling with that specific nausea reserved for high school reunions. I had wanted to turn the car around in the parking lot. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, listing every reason why coming here was a mistake. I felt the old shame rising, the fear of being judged, of being seen as less than. Remy had just reached over from the passenger seat. She didn't offer empty platitudes or tell me it would be fine. She just placed her hand over mine, her skin cool, her grip firm. The scent of her, Santal, old paint, and something uniquely her, filled the small space of the car, grounding me instantly. "I'm right here," she'd said, her voice steady and low. "I'm not going anywhere. We do this for an hour, we drink their cheap wine, and then we leave." That physical anchor was the only reason I made it through the double doors. We moved through the early cocktail hour like a single entity, her shoulder constantly brushing mine, a silent reminder that I wasn't alone in the lion's den. I watched her charm the old varsity quarterback and the valedictorian with equal ease, her laugh a low, throaty sound that made people lean in. She wore a velvet blazer that caught the light, looking effortlessly cool in a room full of people trying too hard. I stood beside her, holding my wine glass like a shield, pretending I belonged. But the anxiety was a low hum beneath my skin, a constant awareness of her, Elise, the woman who had spent our senior year dissecting my insecurities for sport. Elise knew every button to push. She knew how to make me feel small with a single glance. I knew she was here. I could feel it. And then the crowd parted. It wasn't dramatic, just a subtle shift in the room's energy. Elise stood there, holding court, looking exactly as sharp and dangerous as I remembered. She spotted me instantly. Her eyes narrowed, assessing, calculating. I saw the recognition, then the smirk. She began to move toward us, and the air left my lungs. I froze. The trauma bay training vanished. I wasn't the competent professional who managed life and death situations. I was 21 again, feeling small and exposed. Remy must have felt my tension spike because she stepped closer, her presence a solid wall of heat at my back. But even she couldn't stop Elise from closing the distance. I needed a shield. I needed a reason why I wasn't the broken girl Elise remembered. I needed to be someone else, someone loved, someone chosen. And Remy was right there. My best friend, my anchor, the person who knew how I took my coffee and how to talk me down from a panic attack at 3 a.m. The words hung in the air between us, heavy, and terrifying. I didn't dare look at Remy, terrified I'd see confusion or pity. I just stared at Elise, challenging her to find the crack in my armor, while my heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, waiting for the illusion to shatter. Elise didn't just speak, she dissected. She laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that cut through the ambient jazz, drawing eyes toward us. "Fiancée?" she repeated, the word tasting like vinegar in her mouth. She looked me up and down, her gaze lingering on my sensible heels, then flicking to Remy's velvet blazer. "That's surprising. I honestly didn't think you had it in you. I mean, you were always so married to the hospital. I remember you canceling our anniversary dinner for an extra shift because you said the ER needed you more than I did." She tilted her head, feigning sympathy. "I assumed you'd just decided to be alone. It seems safer for you. Less messy." The shame was instant and hot, rising up my neck like a fever. It wasn't just the insult, it was the accuracy. I did hide in my work. I did use the chaos of the trauma bay to avoid the quiet vulnerability of a relationship. The ballroom felt suddenly airless, the crystal chandeliers too bright, the crowd too loud. I was shrinking, reverting to the version of myself that Elise had broken years ago. I stood there, paralyzed, waiting for the inevitable punchline. I waited for Remy to burst out laughing, to slap me on the shoulder and say, "God, no, can you imagine?" I waited for the safety of our platonic reality to reassert itself. But the laugh never came. Instead, the air between us shifted. Remy moved. It wasn't the casual, clumsy bump of a roommate navigating a small kitchen. It was deliberate. She stepped into my personal space with terrifying precision, eliminating the safety gap we'd maintained for a decade. Her arm didn't just loop through mine. It slid around my waist, her hand flattening against the small of my back, fingers splayed, claiming the territory. The heat of her palm burned through the silk of my dress, a shock of contact that grounded me and threw me off balance all at once. She looked at Elise, her expression unbothered, radiating a calm authority that I had never seen in her before. This wasn't the chaotic artist who lost her keys daily. This was someone dangerous. "She is married to her work," Remy said, her voice dropping an octave, rougher than usual, carrying a texture I didn't recognize. "I have to drag her away from the hospital sometimes, but she makes time for what matters." She looked down at me then. The look wasn't friendly. It was intense, focused, the way she looks at a canvas before the first stroke. It took me 3 years to convince her to let me put a ring on it. Elise faltered, her smirk slipping. "Oh, I didn't see a ring." Remy didn't blink. "It's being resized. Vintage. My grandmother's setting. It was a bit loose, and I couldn't risk her losing it inside a patient." The detail was terrifyingly specific. I stared at her, my breath catching. Where was this coming from? Remy was improvising a backstory with the same fluidity she used to mix paints, blending lies with reality until I couldn't tell where the edge was. "So how did it happen?" Elise pressed, her eyes narrowing, looking for the crack in the performance. "The proposal. You're not exactly the romantic type, Remy." I opened my mouth to stammer something vague, but Remy squeezed my waist, a silent command to let her lead. "In the studio," Remy said, her eyes never leaving Elise's face. It was 3 a.m. She'd just come off a double shift. She was exhausted, hair a mess, wearing those terrible blue scrubs she hates. She brought me coffee because she knew I was on a deadline. Remy paused, and her thumb rubbed a slow, hypnotic circle against my spine. I looked at her, standing there in the bad light, covered in hospital grit, and I realized I couldn't go another day without knowing she was mine. The word hung there. Mine. She said it with a weight that settled deep in my gut. It wasn't a line in a play. It felt like a confession. Elise looked between us, searching for the flinch, the hesitation, the tell. But Remy was solid stone. Her touch was heavy, possessive. It said, "Back off." "Well," Elise said finally, her smile tight. "Congratulations, I'm surprised, that's all." She adjusted her clutch, her eyes flicking to Remy's hand on my waist one last time before she turned. "I need a drink." She walked away, retreating into the crowd. The threat was gone. Logic dictated that Remy should step back. She should laugh, roll her eyes, and say, "Wow, that was close." But she didn't move. The hand stayed on my back. The heat of her body was still pressed along my side, a charged proximity that made my skin prickle. I looked up at her, my heart hammering a different rhythm now. "Remy," I whispered. "She's gone." Remy looked down, her eyes dark, pupils blown wide despite the bright ballroom lights. She didn't smile. She didn't joke. She just held me tighter for a fraction of a second, the pressure firm and grounding. "Not yet," she murmured, her gaze tracking Elise's retreat. "She's still watching. We have to sell it." "Remy," I breathed, the name barely a ghost of sound against the rising noise of the reunion jazz band. I tried to create an inch of distance between us, just enough to reclaim my autonomy. "I'm so sorry. I panicked. You can let go now. She's not looking anymore." But Remy didn't let go. If anything, the pressure of her hand against the curve of my waist increased, her fingers splaying wide over the silk of my dress to maximize the contact. She didn't pull back to look at me. Instead, she leaned down, her lips brushing the sensitive skin just below my ear, sending a shiver racing down my spine that had absolutely nothing to do with the venue's aggressive air conditioning. "She is absolutely looking," Remy murmured, her voice a low vibration that I felt resonate in my own chest. "She's by the bar, watching us in the mirror behind the scotch selection. If I let go now, we look like liars who lost their nerve. If I hold you, we look like us. Just breathe, Elle. Follow my lead." I exhaled, forcing my shoulders to drop, and leaned into her. It was a surrender. And in that surrender, the sensory reality of the lie crashed into me with disorienting force. I have known Remy for a decade. I have hugged her 1,000 times, quick, frantic embraces before flights, drunken leans in the back of taxicabs, the desperate comfort of a shoulder to cry on after a patient died on my table. But those touches were transient. They were safe. They were the light, fluid contact of a roommate who respects the boundaries of the lease. This was different. This was the architecture of intimacy. Her hand on my waist was heavy, static, and possessive. It felt like a brand. It wasn't asking for permission. It was asserting a right. As we began to move through the crowd, she steered me not with verbal commands, but with subtle, muscular shifts of that hand, guiding my body with a terrifying familiarity. We navigated the sea of high-top tables and aggressively cheerful balloons as a single entity, hip to hip. I realized with a sudden, sharp clarity that this is how lovers move, orbiting a shared center of gravity, constantly aware of the other's edges, moving with a synchronized instinct that takes years to build. Old classmates descended on us, their earlier indifference replaced by the hungry curiosity people reserve for unexpected romance. We were stopped every 5 feet. "I knew it," a girl from my calculus class lied, beaming at us over her Chardonnay. "You two always had this intense vibe. I told everyone back then." Remy laughed, and the sound was different tonight. Deeper, richer, stripped of her usual deflection. "We took the scenic route," she joked, pulling me a fraction of an inch closer until our bodies were fused from hip to rib cage. But we got there. I found myself staring at her while she charmed the student council president. I saw her every day. I knew how she looked when she brushed her teeth, how she looked covered in gesso. But I hadn't seen her. Not like this. Under the unforgiving crystal chandeliers, the chaotic artist I lived with was gone, replaced by this grounded, magnetic force. I noticed the way the light caught the gold flecks in her hazel eyes, turning them into molten amber, a detail I'd ignored for years over morning coffee. I looked at her hands, the long, capable fingers that were usually stained with charcoal or oil paint. I thought about the strength in them, the way she stretched canvas, the way she was currently holding me up as if I weighed nothing. There was a capability in her touch that I had vastly underestimated. "You're doing great," she whispered during a lull in the conversation, her thumb tracing a slow, deliberate circle against my spine. The motion was hypnotic. It short-circuited my nervous system, bypassing the panic and going straight to the adrenaline. "I feel like I'm going to throw up," I confessed quietly, keeping my smile plastered on for the room. "I'm a terrible liar." "You aren't lying," she assured me, turning to look at me properly. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, then back up to my eyes. It was a look of such intense, focused heat that my breath hitched in my throat. "You look incredible, Elle. It's not exactly hard work pretending to be in love with you. I think it might be the easiest thing I've done all year." The words landed softly, but they hit with the force of a collision. My heart hammered against my ribs, echoing the rhythm of a code blue. That didn't sound like a line. That sounded like a secret. A vulnerability bloomed raw in my chest, a terrifying realization of how easily I fit into this role. I wasn't just tolerating her arm around me. I was leaning into it. I was craving the stability of her heat. For a few minutes, the lie felt more real than the last 10 years of my solitary life. We were turning toward the bar, perhaps seeking liquid courage, when the trap snapped shut. A group of our closest mutual friends from college, the ones who knew us best, the ones who knew every detail of our dating histories and every breakdown we'd shared, blocked our path. Sarah, Mike, and Jen. They formed a wall of skepticism and delight, their expressions expectant. "Okay, stop right there," Sarah demanded, crossing her arms and blocking our escape route. "We need the truth. You guys have been platonic soulmates for a decade. I have watched you date other people. When did this happen? How did we miss it? We want the story, the real story. Don't leave anything out." The air thickened around us. This wasn't a casual inquiry from a stranger. This was an interrogation by the people who would know if we were lying. I froze, my mind blanking on the timeline, terrified that one wrong detail would unravel the safety net Remy had spun. But Remy didn't flinch. She just smiled, that slow, dangerous smile that usually preceded her doing something reckless with her art. She squeezed my waist, a silent signal that she had this, and that I just needed to hold on. "It's a long story," Remy said, her voice dropping into a hush that made them all lean in closer. But I think we both knew, long before we admitted it. Remy didn't hesitate. She leaned back against the edge of the high-top table, pulling me with her until I was effectively bracketed between her legs, a position so casually intimate it made my breath catch in my throat. She looked at Sarah, then at Mike, her expression softening into something reminiscent, almost wistful. "You guys remember the blizzard of 14? She asked, her voice dropping to that low, textured register she usually reserved for discussing art theory or expensive wine. "Junior year? When the power grid failed across the entire tri-state area?" "God, yes," Mike groaned, shaking his head. "We were freezing in the dorms. I think we burned a textbook for warmth." "We were in the off-campus apartment," Remy corrected, her hand moving from my waist to rest lightly on my hip bone, her thumb brushing the fabric there in a slow, rhythmic caress. "The heating died on the first night. We built a fortress out of blankets in the living room. I remembered it vividly. I remembered the cold, the smell of stale wax, the silence of a city buried under snow. I remembered studying for my pharmacology final by the light of 3 distinct vanilla-scented candles because they were the only ones we had. I was working on that terrible abstract series, Remy continued, her eyes finding mine now, ignoring our audience entirely. Or at least, that's what I told everyone. I told Elle I was sketching the shadows on the wall. She paused, and the air between us seemed to thin, becoming rare and charged. But I wasn't looking at the wall. I spent 3 days watching the candlelight flicker on her face. I watched her memorize drug interactions and beta blocker side effects while the world froze outside. She was so focused, so incredibly steady in the middle of all that cold and chaos. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. That wasn't in the script. That wasn't a fabrication we had agreed upon in the car. We were stuck in that blizzard. I did study by candlelight, but I had always assumed Remy was lost in her own head, obsessing over composition and form. The idea that she had been watching me, that she had been cataloging the light on my skin while I murmured chemical formulas, felt like a physical touch, more intimate than her hand on my hip. That was it for me, Remy said softly, her thumb pressing harder against my hip, grounding me. I think I knew right then. I looked at her and realized I was never going to find anyone else who made the quiet feel so loud. She was the only thing in the room that made sense. Sarah let out a soft, audible sigh, her skepticism dissolving into sentimentality. Remy, I had no idea. I didn't say anything, Remy confessed, turning her gaze back to our friends, though her body remained angled toward mine, protective and possessive. You know how I am. I live in color and noise. I lose my keys, I forget to eat, I paint until my hands cramp. Elle, she's the line work. She's the structure holding the composition together. I was terrified that if I said something, if I crossed that line, I'd break the one thing that kept me standing. I couldn't risk losing my best friend just because I fell in love with her. The artist in her was painting a masterpiece right now, reframing a decade of platonic coexistence as a tortured, slow burn romance. She described my dedication, my structured life, not as a bore, but as a muse. She made my neuroses sound like virtues. And the terrifying part was that it didn't sound like a lie. It sounded like a perspective shift, a camera angle changing to reveal a scene I had been standing in the middle of without ever seeing. I felt a vulnerability bloom raw in my chest. I wondered, with a sudden, vertigo-inducing lurch, if she was inventing this perspective to sell the con, or if she was finally revealing a truth she had hidden for 10 years. I was scared too, I heard myself say. The words bypassed my filter, trembling with a honesty I hadn't intended to share. I looked at Remy, and for a moment, the room fell away. I wasn't performing for Sarah or Mike. I was answering the confession she had just laid on the table. I thought we were too different. I thought I was too rigid for you. I didn't want to be the one who ruined the masterpiece. Remy's eyes widened slightly, the gold flecks in them catching the chandelier light. She looked shattered and hopeful, a complex expression that no amount of acting could manufacture. The air thickened, charged with the weight of 10 years of missed signals. You didn't ruin it, she whispered, leaning in until her forehead almost brushed mine. You are the masterpiece, Elle. The silence that followed was absolute. Our friends had faded into the background scenery. The reunion noise was just static. There was only the heat of her hand, the scent of her santal perfume, and the terrifying realization that we had just stepped off the ledge together. Then a chime rang out, sharp, clear, and intrusive. Dinner is served, a voice announced over the PA system, shattering the moment. The spell broke, but the tension didn't dissipate. It just coiled tighter, waiting. We had to move. We had to sit down. and I realized with a jolt of adrenaline that the performance was moving from the stage to the table, where there would be nowhere left to hide. The transition to the banquet tables forced a shift in geometry. Standing, we could create illusions of space. Seated, we were compressed into a radius of inevitable contact. The round tables were too small for 10 adults, forcing elbows to brush and chairs to scrape together. Remy pulled my chair out with a courtly grace that felt both mocking and sincere, then sat close enough that her thigh pressed firmly against mine under the heavy starch of the white tablecloth. It wasn't an accidental brush. It was a blockade. She planted her leg against mine and left it there, a steady line of heat radiating through the silk of my dress. I tried to shift away, just a fraction, to reclaim some autonomy over my own nervous system, but the table leg trapped me. I was pinned between the furniture and the woman who had just rewritten our entire history. "Comfortable?" she murmured, leaning in to pour water into my glass. Her voice was low, skipping across the surface of the table noise to land directly in my ear. "You're enjoying this," I whispered back, gripping my napkin like a tourniquet. "I'm committed to the role," she corrected, her eyes dancing. "There's a difference." The table conversation inevitably circled back to the wedding. It was the chum in the water, and our old classmates were circling. They wanted dates, venues, color palettes, the administrative trivia of romance that I had never once considered. I felt a spike of panic. I can recite the dosage protocols for epinephrine in my sleep, but I couldn't name a single wedding florist. Remy didn't miss a beat. She didn't just field the questions. She curated them. "We're keeping it small," she told the table, her hand finding mine on top of the tablecloth now, her thumb tracing the sensitive skin of my inner wrist. The touch was rhythmic, distracting. Elle hates being the center of attention. You know that. Putting her in a room with 300 people staring at her is her nightmare scenario. She was right. I stared at her, startled again by the accuracy of the lie. "So what, elopement?" asked a girl named Jessica, leaning forward. "Private ceremony," I managed to say, finding my voice. I looked at Remy, drawing courage from the steady pressure of her thumb against my pulse point. "Somewhere quiet, maybe the coast. Just us and the people who actually know us." "We're thinking October," Remy added, weaving another thread into the tapestry. "The light is better for the photos. And Elle loves the rain." She squeezed my hand, and the casual intimacy of it, the knowledge of my favorite weather, the protective instinct to keep the ceremony small, made my chest ache. It was a fantasy constructed from the real bricks of our friendship. It felt dangerous because it was plausible. The waiters arrived, clearing the main course and depositing plates of dark chocolate ganache. The conversation lulled as people focused on the sugar, but the tension between Remy and me only escalated. The air around us felt thick, charged with the static of unsaid things. "You're not eating," Remy noted softly. "Nerves," I admitted. "My stomach is in knots." "Here." She picked up her fork, cutting a small, precise piece of the torte. She didn't push the plate toward me. She lifted the fork. It was a small gesture. In any other context, it might have been playful. But here, under the lights, with her knee pressed against mine and the weight of her claim still hanging in the air, it felt incredibly erotic. It was a demand for surrender. I hesitated. The table watched. Elise was watching from 2 tables away, her gaze heavy and skeptical. I could feel her waiting for the crack in the facade. I leaned forward. I opened my mouth. Remy's hand was steady. She fed me the bite with a terrifying precision, her eyes locked on mine. The metal of the fork was cool against my lip. The chocolate was rich and bitter on my tongue. She didn't pull away immediately. She held the gaze, held the moment, creating a bubble of privacy in the middle of the crowded room. "Good?" she asked, her voice dropping to a register that made my toes curl. "Yes," I breathed. And I wasn't talking about the dessert. My heart rate climbed, mimicking the staccato rhythm of a patient crashing. You can't fake the flush rising on your skin or the way your pupils dilate when someone you trust steps inside your guard. I was reacting to her not as my roommate, but as the lover she was pretending to be. You have a little... Remy reached out, her thumb brushing the corner of my mouth. The touch was feather-light, a ghost of pressure that sent a shockwave straight to my core. She lingered there, her fingers cupping my jaw, turning my face slightly toward her. "Elise is staring," she whispered, her lips barely moving. I don't care about Elise, I realized, speaking the truth for the first time all night. I didn't. I cared about the heat of Remy's hand on my face. I cared about the way the room seemed to blur at the edges, leaving only her in focus. "Good," Remy said, her eyes darkening. "Because I'm not doing this for her anymore." The lights in the ballroom dimmed suddenly, signaling the end of dinner and the start of the dancing. The band struck up a slow, heavy rhythm. The atmosphere shifted from social to sultry, and I saw Elise stand up, smoothing her dress, her eyes fixed on us. She was coming back. She wasn't done. Remy saw her too. Her hand slid from my jaw to my shoulder, gripping tight. "Ready?" she asked. "For what?" "To prove it," she said. Elise didn't wait for an invitation. She materialized at the edge of our table just as the first few notes of a ballad saturated the room, her silhouette cutting through the dim lighting like a jagged line in a soft painting. She had been watching the dessert exchange. I knew she had, but her expression wasn't one of defeat. It was the look of a gambler who thinks she has found a tell. "It's a lovely story," Elise said, her voice pitching just loud enough to carry over the music, ensuring the surrounding tables could hear the critique. She leaned one hand on the back of my chair, leaning into our private space. "The blizzard, the candlelight, it's very cinematic. But I have to be honest, Elle, watching you two, it feels a bit clinical." She tilted her head, her smile sharp enough to draw blood. "You look comfortable, sure, like siblings, or roommates who share a checking account. But I don't see the spark. Where is the heat? Where is the reason you supposedly couldn't live without her?" The accusation landed squarely in the center of my chest. It was the same weapon she had used against me years ago. The idea that I was too cold, too analytical to inspire passion. I felt the familiar freeze response kicking in, my tongue heavy in my mouth. I opened my mouth to defend us, to offer some weak platitude about private affection. But Remy moved before I could speak. She didn't argue. She didn't offer a verbal rebuttal. She simply stood up, the legs of her chair scraping against the floor with a decisive sound that cut through Elise's monologue. Remy buttoned her blazer with one hand, her eyes locked on mine, ignoring Elise entirely. "Dance with me," she said. It wasn't a question. She extended her hand, and I took it. The moment our skin touched, she pulled me up and out of the chair, guiding me past Elise without a backward glance. The grip was firm, reassuring, and carried a momentum that swept me directly into the center of the dance floor. The atmosphere shifted the second we crossed the threshold onto the parquet. The air here was heavier, thicker, vibrating with the bass of the slow song. Remy didn't leave room for hesitation. She turned me into her, and then she closed the distance completely. In college, we had danced at parties. Loose, chaotic movement fueled by cheap beer and adrenaline. This was not that. Remy stepped into my space until there was no air left between us. She slid her right hand to the small of my back, splaying her fingers wide to cover the span of my spine, and pulled me flush against her. The impact of her body against mine was a sensory shockwave. We aligned perfectly, chest to chest, hip to hip, a sudden, seamless architecture of limbs that felt shocking in its precision. I gasped, a small, involuntary sound that was lost in the music. The proximity was overwhelming. I could feel the steady, rhythmic thrum of her heart beating against my own chest. I could feel the heat radiating from her, soaking through the layers of her clothes and my silk dress, a transfusion of warmth that chased away the ballroom's chill. "Relax," she murmured, her voice a low vibration against my temple. Let go, Elle. I've got you. I rested my head on her shoulder, burying my face in the curve of her neck. The sensory details crashed over me. The texture of her velvet blazer was soft and slightly rough against my cheek, a tactile anchor in the spinning room. She smelled of the expensive Santal perfume she always wore, but beneath that there was the scent of warm skin and the faint, sharp tang of champagne, the scent of Remy. It was intoxicating. We swayed in the center of the room, moving not as two people trying to coordinate steps, but as a single, fluid entity. Remy led with a subtle, intuitive authority, her thigh guiding mine, her hands on my back steering us through the turns. It felt safe, terrifyingly safe. But beneath the safety, something else was waking up, a sharp, jagged desire that had been dormant for a decade. I realized, with a sudden, vertigo-inducing clarity, that I wasn't pretending anymore. I wasn't resting my head on her shoulder to sell a lie to my ex. I was doing it because it was the only place in the world I wanted to be. The boundaries of our friendship, carefully maintained for 10 years, were dissolving in the heat between our bodies. Remy shifted her hand, sliding it up from my waist to the nape of my neck, her fingers threading into my hair. The intimacy of the gesture nearly buckled my knees. You have no idea, she whispered, her lips brushing the sensitive shell of my ear. How long I have wanted to hold you like this, without an excuse, without a crisis. The words blurred the line between the performance and the reality until it vanished completely. My breath hitched. She wasn't talking to the audience. She was talking to me. The song began to fade, the final notes hanging suspended in the air. The other couples began to pull apart, creating respectable distances. But Remy didn't let go. She held me there, in the center of the floor, her hand still tangled in my hair, her body still pressed against mine, defying the social cue to separate. We stood there, caught in the afterglow of the movement, breathing the same air. I pulled back slightly to look at her, and the expression on her face was raw, stripped of all the earlier bravado. She looked wrecked. Then, the spell broke. A shadow fell over us. Elise had circled back, unwilling to let the moment stand. She stepped into our periphery, her arms crossed, her eyes cold. She wasn't convinced. She wanted the final proof. Well, Elise said, her voice cutting through the silence between us. That was engaging, but anyone can dance. She looked at Remy, then at me, throwing down the gauntlet. If this is real, prove it. Kiss her. The challenge hung in the air between us, suspended like smoke, heavy and suffocating. A kiss. It was a crude, desperate demand, a final attempt by Elise to strip away the armor we had constructed and expose the fraud beneath. The ballroom felt suddenly microscopic, the eyes of the crowd feeling like physical weights pressing against my skin. In any other life, in any other version of this night, I would have laughed it off. I would have grabbed Remy's hand, made a charming joke about keeping the romance private, and walked away with my dignity intact. But the air between Remy and me was no longer breathable. It was too thick with the friction of the last hour, charged with the dangerous electricity of the dance floor. Backing down now didn't feel like an option. It felt like a betrayal of the reality we had just touched. Remy didn't move immediately. She didn't lunge forward to prove a point or perform for the cheap seats. Instead, she turned fully toward me, her body blocking out Elise, blocking out the stairs, creating a private universe in the middle of the crowded floor. She brought her hands up slowly, sliding them from my shoulders to cup my face. Her palms were hot, trembling slightly, a detail that shattered my composure more than her confidence ever could. She looked at me. It wasn't the look of a conspirator asking if I was ready to commit to the bit. Her gaze was unflinching, raw, and terrifyingly open. She was asking for permission, yes, but she was also asking a question that had been sitting in the silence between us for 10 years. "Is this okay?" her eyes asked. "Are we finally crossing this line?" I looked at her mouth. I thought about the decade of shared coffees, the silent comfort of our apartment, the way she had anchored me tonight. And I realized, with a jolt that stopped my heart, that I wasn't nodding for Elise. I wasn't doing this to win a game or save face. I was nodding because the gravitational pull was finally too strong to resist. I tilted my head up, a millimeter of surrender. Remy closed the distance. It wasn't the aggressive, performative smash of lips I expected for an audience. It was slow, agonizingly, beautifully slow. I felt the warmth of her breath against my skin a second before I felt her. When her lips finally brushed mine, it was a question. Soft, tentative, a testing of the waters. It tasted of champagne and the inevitable. Then she made a sound, a low, rough intake of breath against my mouth, and the hesitation vanished. The kiss deepened, shifting instantly from a question to a statement. It was a slow, deliberate read of my intentions. Her mouth moved against mine with a familiarity that shouldn't have been possible for a first kiss, yet felt like a memory I had always possessed. It was the texture of velvet and the heat of a fever. The room dissolved. The jazz band, the clinking glasses, Elise's judgment, it all turned to static and fell away. There was only Remy. There was only the pressure of her hands holding my face like I was precious, like I was breakable. I felt her desperation, the raw, jagged edge of a desire she had kept leashed for a decade. It poured into me, overwhelming my senses. I wound my arms around her neck, pulling her closer, erasing the last millimeter of space between us. I forgot we were acting. I forgot this was a lie. I kissed her back with everything I had hidden in the dark corners of my heart, every suppressed longing, every time I had watched her sleep and wanted to reach out. It was a conversation, a confession. "I am here," her mouth seemed to say. "I have always been here." The kiss held the weight of every missed opportunity, every almost, every time we had stood in a kitchen and let the silence stretch too long. It was overwhelming, drowning out the rational part of my brain that screamed danger. When we finally pulled apart, it wasn't because we wanted to. It was because we needed air. The separation was physical pain. I opened my eyes, my vision blurring. Remy looked wrecked. Her lips were swollen, her eyes blown wide and unguarded. She looked at me with a mixture of terror and hope that shattered me. She wasn't acting. You can't fake that kind of ruin. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. I blinked, the real world rushing back in a disorienting flood. I looked past Remy's shoulder. Elise was still standing there, but the smirk was gone. She looked pale, staring at us as if she had just witnessed a natural disaster. She didn't say a word. She couldn't. The authenticity of what just happened had stripped her of her weapon. She turned on her heel and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. But it didn't matter. The victory felt hollow, irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was the woman standing in front of me, breathing hard, looking at me like I was the only person on earth. We didn't wait for the applause to die down, or for the murmurs of the crowd to dissect what they had just witnessed. We didn't wait for Elise to recover her composure, or for our college friends to ask the questions that were undoubtedly burning in their throats. The need to leave was sudden and absolute, a physical imperative that seized us both at the exact same moment. It wasn't a retreat. It was an evacuation. Remy's hand found mine again, not with the performative flair she had used in the ballroom, but with a desperate, crushing grip. She pulled me toward the double doors, moving with a velocity that discouraged anyone from trying to stop us. We cut through the lingering stragglers near the coat check, ignoring the waves and the curious glances. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My entire world had narrowed down to the sensation of her palm against mine and the sound of our heels clicking in rapid, syncopated rhythm against the polished marble of the hallway. The silence between us as we walked to the elevator banks was heavy. But it wasn't empty. It was filled with the static of what had just happened, a vibrating tension that made the air feel thin. The elevator arrived with a cheerful ding that felt obscenely bright for the gravity of the moment. We stepped inside, the metal doors sliding shut to seal us into a box of mirrored steel and fluorescent light. In the sudden quiet, the absence of the jazz band and the chatter was deafening. This was the moment where, logically, she should have let go. The audience was gone, the performance was over. There was no one here to convince, no ex-girlfriend to intimidate. But Remy didn't release my hand. Instead, her fingers interlaced with mine, locking us together. She stared straight ahead at the digital numbers counting down the floors, her jaw set tight, a muscle feathering in her cheek. I watched our reflection in the brushed steel doors, two women in formal wear, chests heaving slightly, holding hands like we were afraid gravity might reverse itself if we let go. The lobby was empty, a cavernous space of shadows and night staff. We pushed through the revolving doors and spilled out into the cool, damp air of the parking lot. The temperature drop was a shock to the system, the humidity of the ballroom replaced by the sharp clarity of the night. I took a deep breath, the cold air stinging my lungs, trying to clear the scent of champagne and adrenaline from my head. But it didn't work. The smell of her, that mix of santal and warm skin, was still clinging to me, a sensory memory that refused to fade. We reached her car, an old, reliable sedan that smelled of turpentine and coffee cups, a familiar, grounding scent that usually made me feel safe. Tonight, however, the enclosed space felt different. As we slid into the front seats and the doors clicked shut, the silence of the car amplified the tension until it was a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. It was too intimate. The space was too small. Remy didn't start the engine immediately. She sat there, gripping the steering wheel with both hands, staring out into the darkness of the parking lot. The streetlights cast long, amber shadows across her face, highlighting the sharp curve of her jaw and the tension in her shoulders. The confident, swaggering fiancée who had commanded the ballroom was gone. In her place was the Remy I knew, the one who second-guessed her brushstrokes, the one who felt things too deeply. "Elle," she said finally. Her voice was rough, stripped of the earlier bravado, cracking slightly on the single syllable. She didn't look at me. "Are you okay?" The question hung in the air, absurdly inadequate. "Okay?" I had just kissed my best friend of 10 years in front of everyone we knew, and I had enjoyed it. I had felt a door in my chest kick open, revealing a room I had spent a decade pretending didn't exist. "I don't know," I whispered, the truth slipping out before I could polish it. I looked at our hands, realizing with a jolt that even now, across the center console, we were still touching. My left hand was resting on the gear shift, and her right hand had covered it, her thumb brushing my knuckles in a frantic, unconscious rhythm. "I didn't mean to," she started, then stopped, shaking her head. "No, that's a lie. I did mean to." She finally turned to look at me, and the raw vulnerability in her eyes stole the breath from my lungs. I didn't think I'd ever actually do it." I looked at her, really looked at her, and the terrifying realization settled over me like a heavy blanket. We couldn't go back. The fiancé lie hadn't just protected me from Elise. It had burned down the structure of our friendship. The roommate agreement was ash. "Drive," I said, my voice trembling but certain. "Just drive us home, Remy." She nodded, turning the key. The engine sputtered to life, vibrating through the seats. As she pulled out of the lot, merging onto the highway that led back to our shared life, she didn't move her hand from mine. And for the first time in 10 years, I didn't pull away to keep us safe. I laced my fingers through hers, and I held on. The apartment door clicked shut, sealing us inside. But we couldn't lock out the energy we had dragged in from the night. The silence of our shared space, usually a comfort after long shifts, felt heavy, pressurized by the truth sitting squarely in the hallway. I watched Remy toe off her boots, her movements slow and heavy with exhaustion. She shed the velvet blazer, tossing it over the back of the sofa, stripping away the armor of the fiancé to reveal the artist underneath. She looked vulnerable in the dim light of the entryway, the gold flecks in her eyes dulled by a sudden, palpable fear. I stood there in my silk reunion dress, feeling the phantom weight of her hand still burning on my waist. The distance between us was only a few feet of scuffed hardwood floor, but it felt like a canyon we had finally, terrifiedly, built a bridge across. I couldn't pretend this was just a weird night we'd laugh about over pancakes in the morning. "Remy," I said, my voice cutting the stillness like a scalpel. That wasn't acting. On the dance floor, in the car, that wasn't a performance. She froze, her back to me. For a long, agonizing second, I thought she might deny it, might try to salvage the safety of our old, sterile dynamic. Then she turned, and the look on her face broke me. It was raw, open, and terrifyingly hopeful. "No," she said, her voice rough, stripped of all artifice. "It wasn't. I'm a terrible actor, Elle. You know that. I can't fake the way I look at you." She took a step toward me, then stopped, as if waiting for permission to enter my space again. "I've been in love with you since that night the power went out. Since before that. I've been waiting for a sign, for a crack in the wall, for anything that said you might want me back. Tonight, when you grabbed my arm, I just stopped waiting." The confession hung in the air, the final brushstroke on the picture she had been painting for 10 years. She hadn't just been my roommate. She had been the keeper of a devotion I was too blind or too scared to see. I felt the nurse in me, the professional who triaged trauma and kept emotions sterile, crumble. I had spent a decade healing strangers while ignoring the open wound of my own longing. I had chosen safety over the terrifying possibility of this, convincing myself that a platonic love was enough. "I didn't want to lose you," I confessed, the words tearing out of my throat, jagged and real. "I thought if I crossed the line, if I wanted too much, I'd lose the only person who actually understands me." "You could never lose me," Remy whispered, her gaze holding mine, unflinching. "I'm right here. I'm always right here." I crossed the room. I didn't walk, I gravitated. I reached for her, my hands finding the familiar warmth of her arms, and the contact was electric. This time, there was no Elise to perform for. There were no eyes on us. It was just Remy and me, standing in the kitchen where we'd shared 1,000 platonic coffees, finally breaking the rules. I pulled her into a desperate hug, burying my face in her neck, breathing in the heat and the reality of her skin. She held me back with a strength that shook, her arms wrapping around me like she was trying to fuse our ribs together. When she kissed me, it wasn't the tentative question of the ballroom. It was an answer. It was deep, hungry, and overwhelming. It tasted of surrender and years of silence finally breaking. We moved together blindly, the momentum carrying us until we were tangling on the sofa, the distance between us permanently closed. The fake engagement was a ghost. This, the heat of her skin, the frantic beat of her heart against mine, was the only truth that mattered. The morning light hit the cheap rhinestone ring still on my finger, turning the glass into a diamond. It was a prop that had suddenly become a promise. Remy shifted beside me, her arm thrown heavy over my waist, anchoring me to this new, terrifyingly bright reality. The lie hadn't just saved me from an ex's judgment. It had finally given me the courage to claim the life I actually wanted. If you've ever hidden the truth to protect your heart, subscribe now for more stories of unmasked desire.